today we have another amazing surviving sibling with us. And I feel so lucky to have known you, Samantha, through most of your grief journey. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Maya.
I say it almost every episode. It's bittersweet when siblings come on the show, but your story is a really important one to talk about. And it's not really something I've talked a whole lot about on the show because it's involving losing your brother and a lot of anticipatory grief and losing your brother to cancer. And so this is something that I feel like I have more knowledge around too. And it's a great time for us to talk about it and shed a lot of light on it, talk about your story. So Samantha, tell us a little bit about Chris, your relationship, kind of paint that picture for us so we understand your dynamic and who he is and was.
Okay. Chris was my older brother. I mean, I still say is. And everybody asks like how many siblings you have. I still say 3. So I mean 2 other siblings. There's 3 of us.
Right.
So he was my older brother by five or and a little bit more years. And then we also had a younger brother, Robert. Chris and I were very close for like ever, I feel like, because even when we were little kids, even though they were 5 years apart, we hung out. There was a little bit of time in there when he became a teenager that we really didn't hang out, and then we got close again. And I mean, I don't know what else to say. Like, and we just had a great relationship. He was the ideal older brother, was there to protect me, even though I could do it myself. He still stepped in when needed. He always took care of me. I had parents, obviously, but we had a good family dynamic. My parents are still together. My older brother, I did find out before he passed that he was only my half sibling, which didn't even matter to me or my younger brother. I always did question things. Like, he really doesn't fully look like me, whereas my younger brother is like a twin. So there were just some questions, but I'm like, whatever. It's just genetics. Whatever it is. But I didn't find out until the October before he died. So I think it was October. I can't remember exactly, but it was around right before we knew he was going to pass away.
Yeah.
So
how did you guys so tell us a little bit about that, because it's very interesting this season. We have a lot of interesting family dynamics, which I think is helpful for people to know that, not everyone comes from this perfect cookie cutter, like there's a lot of dynamics that go on with loss. So tell us a little bit about that real quick, Samantha. How did you guys find? Chris had no knowledge. Like, tell us a little bit about how you found out.
Chris knew since he was probably 17 or 18 because he was going to go into the service. I vaguely remember a fight between my parents and Chris. I had no idea what it was about. I just remember it was a big deal and Chris took off. I mean, he eventually came home, but I found out through my ex-sister-in-law, who was not a nice person. And I had to tell my parents that she told me. And I don't know why she told me.
And this was October. And of course, we were going to talk about it, but he passed in January. And this is when he was actively dying and going through cancer, right? So She decides to tell you this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. And ironically, my mom had said to me the night before, and my younger brother, me and Daddy need to meet with you too. I'm like, oh God, I already know what this is about because I had already known for a few days. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I had already known for a few days. Robert, sorry, I don't know if I should be saying his name, but he didn't know anything until I went to my parents' house and I said, I need to talk to you tonight. And it was the night before they were going to tell us. And I don't even remember the conversation, but my mom, I was in the driveway of my parents' house. I called my mom and said, I need to talk to you guys. And I just remember my mom yelling out for my dad, get out here. She knows. And then my younger brother came out. They let me in the house, and like I didn't really need to say anything because my parents knew that I knew. But of course, my younger brother was still like, "What is happening here?" And they had to tell him. And we come to find out that my brother never wanted to tell us. He didn't
Good.
want anything to hurt our relationship with each other because we all were pretty darn close. And my dad didn't want either of us to know because he felt like the dynamics were going to change because Chris was our half brother. But the more I thought about it, I'm like, that wouldn't have changed anything, no matter when I found out, because he's been there all my whole life. He's still
Yep.
my brother. So that's the short of the long story of the whole thing that I could remember of it all.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that part. I just wanted to highlight that because it's something that happened during your brother actively dying. And, I think that, that's that's traumas that happen within the trauma of loss, right? And it is a part of your story. So I wanted to kind of highlight that. So thanks for sharing. I know that's not an easy thing to share, but walk us through a little bit. I mean, you guys had this really, again, this beautiful family dynamic. I've always loved that about your story and how you've shared that. But tell us, kind of I know that there's been difficulty with, the dynamic with the wife and all of that. There's a lot there too. But walk us through kind of where Chris was and his diagnosis and how all of that happened, because I know this was a long journey. It was not a one, right? And I think a lot of people will connect with this.
So he was diagnosed in July of 2019. They told him that it wasn't too far in, it's esophageal cancer. It wasn't too far into the different layers of the esophagus, and that they could do surgery. But he had to go through all these different things before the surgery could happen. And in September of 2019, he went through major surgery, and I was scared I was going to lose him then. Um, so in that time, his fiance decided they wanted to get married. I just want to throw that in there in August, a month before his major surgery. So they removed the part of the esophagus where they thought the lesion was advancing to, and then they removed part of his stomach, and then they basically sewed him back together, to put it in basic terms. I remember walking into the hospital when I saw him then, and he looked like he was dead then, and it was scary as hell.
Take us back for a second, Samantha. When he got the diagnosis, what did that look like for your family? Did he call you? What did that look like? How did you guys find out about that? And then, we'll jump back forward. But I'm curious about that because we all talk about the call, right?
Yeah.
And we all talk about how that is.
Yeah.
And I think something to point out in anticipatory grief is there are multiple calls, right? It's like, so this is like your initial call.
Yeah, this is the first call. Yeah, my mom actually called me. I remember, I kind of remember her texting me and saying, I need to talk to you. And I was out to lunch with friends from work or whatever. And I called her and I tried to be by myself because I felt like this is weird. She doesn't text me like that. And I got on the phone with her and she told me, it's hard to remember everything from way then. But I remember her saying, your brother's been diagnosed with cancer, but they're going to do surgery. I was like, okay, all right. And then things just kept going quick during July to September. And I just remember going to appointments with him because at that time I was his medical proxy. So I kind of needed to be there for decisions, and he trusted me with that. So that was the first call. And that's what I remember about that. I think I blocked a lot of that part out. I don't remember what I did after that.
Well, I think you that again, these are all these points that we want to talk about and bring up in your story and anticipatory grief, right? And there's that initial call and there's subsequent calls, right? And it's this kind of bookend calls, and we'll talk about all of that. But, that's a big part of your story too, is you at that time went into kind of like what a lot of us with the sudden loss go through, like, okay, like roll our sleeves up. How are we gonna
Right.
handle things? Right. That was it's interesting in anticipatory grief because you kind of go through that process in a different, way. It's
Right.
prior, right? You're going through it before. So you're kind of from what I understand from your story, you're kind of in the mode where you're like, okay, let's handle this. Let's go. We're going to the doctors. We're going to get surgery. We're going to, you're kind of in take care of business mode, right?
Yeah, you're right. And that's how I am. Like when
Mhm.
something needs to be done, I take care of business. So, um, September, he had the surgery. The doctor said that he's going to live a long, happy life. Great. Went on with everything. Recovery was tough, but he got better. But he only had a small bit of a stomach, so it was like weird seeing my brother only eat like a bird. But he was happy. He was doing great.
And
So
how long was he recovering in the hospital after his
he
surgery?
was in the hospital, I think, for a couple months. I can't remember exactly. I just remember taking care of him at his house. That's all I remember. I don't remember being at the hospital too much until later on, like
Yep.
when things really happened. So he went home.
We hope you're enjoying this incredible episode of the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. We'll be back in just a minute after hearing from our incredible sponsor. Are you feeling lost in your grief journey? Perhaps even stuck? As a surviving sibling, I too have felt lost, stuck, confused, angry. Well, fill in the blank. I've felt so many emotions along my grief journey. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about too. Along the way, I found that what I needed was answers to all of my unanswered questions, validation, permission to feel everything that I was feeling at different times, and ultimately, I needed guidance. That's why I created the Grief Guide for Surviving Siblings. This is a 23-page guide that guides you, the surviving sibling, along your grief journey. Written and created by a surviving sibling for surviving siblings. Click the link in the show notes to get your copy or visit thesurvivingsiblings.com, where you can also find more show information, merchandise for surviving siblings like you, and more resources and support.
I think something important too, and about what you said, is that, the doctor was telling you everything is great. He's going to live a great life. But there's something interesting where you walked in and just you knowing him so well that you just shared, you're like, you just didn't look like himself. Like
Right.
that's like another initial gut feeling that we get when we're really connected to someone. So I just wanted to circle back to that because that's kind of a moment too in this
So
story.
when I walked in, now that you're bringing back more memories, I walked in and he had all these the tube out of his mouth and all the IVs and all this stuff. And I don't know, like there were bells and stuff. I remember that. And I remember turning around to my husband and just crying. Like, he's like, what is wrong? He's okay. I'm like, but he doesn't look okay. He looks dead already.
Yeah.
So that was difficult. But weeks went on and he got better with it. So we were looking good for a long time because we rode out 2020 with COVID, but he didn't get his scans because he kept getting pushed back because of COVID. And this was all through the VA too. So they didn't feel safe bringing him in. So he didn't get scans. He probably didn't get a recent scan, I would say, until fall of 2020, I think it was.
Wow. So basically a year went by. That's a long time after such a significant surgery.
Right. And then 2021 came and he was developing, which they knew was there, a hernia near the site of surgery, but it had already been there, but they didn't repair it when they were in. Don't know why. Never asked any questions.
That was my first thought. I'm like, why? Why wouldn't they?
I don't know. And
I'm not a doctor, but I'm curious.
Right. I mean, the only thing I could think of, because I do have a medical background, is that they didn't want to keep him under anesthesia longer than he already had, because it was a long surgery.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I'd say it was like 8 to 10 hours.
Wow.
My mom remembers exactly how long, but I can't remember. I just remember I went to work because I had to go to work because it was the only thing to keep me going. And my mom updated me throughout the day of the surgery. So don't know why it wasn't repaired. So it started getting bigger in 2021. So he went and got another scan. I would say it was in spring. Yeah, it was definitely in spring. And then that was when they decided they were going to go in and repair the hernia because it was starting to affect a lot of things going on. He barely was eating because of it. And then he had surgery and he was fine he had surgery in June, the end of June, July, August. October, near the end of October, he started getting sick again. He wasn't looking good.
So we're 2 years after the surgery now.
Yeah. 2 years. And I mean, I wasn't reading into it. I was like, oh, maybe it's just from the hernia. Maybe he just doesn't feel good because of that being repaired. And like he had a surgery 2 years prior and now he just had another surgery. But Halloween of 2021 was when it really went down. We went trick-or-treating. Not my brother. He stayed home because he didn't feel well. And I go home with my kids. I was actually with his wife and her kid. And after 8 o'clock that night, I get a phone call from her and she's frantic. And she says, he's throwing up blood. And I'm like, this is it. Because knowing the medical background, when someone has cancer and the blood vomiting happens, it's getting close. But we didn't think it was happening again. Like nobody said, oh, the cancer is spreading. They never said anything about that. And it just happened that it spread to his liver. And I even said to him, I was waiting and sitting in the room where they go and put the port in for the chemo and stuff. And I said, I can get Matt and see if I can give you part of my liver. And he was like, you would do that? And I'm like, yeah, I would do that. Like, why wouldn't I do that? But it ended up he was way too far advanced to have that done. So they were trying chemo. And during this process, he actually was switched from Rutgers to Sloan Kettering because we didn't feel like Rutgers was taking the best care of him because he was VA. So he was transferred over and like we didn't feel like they were doing enough. So Sloan Kettering actually had a better outlook for us. They were like, we're going to give him chemo and all this other stuff, and we're going to support him. We're going to do scans. And they had been seeing something like a cloud on his liver, or a couple of them, but they couldn't tell if it was definitely cancer tumor. And I don't even remember when they told him that they were tumors and it had spread to the liver.
Tell us a little bit, Samantha, if you go back for just a second. So this all happened on Halloween, right?
It was through Halloween. From Halloween through to Thanksgiving. So it was all.
But prior to that, he was just feeling kind of not so great, had the hernia, like nothing was showing up on scans. We weren't concerned. And then all of a sudden it's back, it's spread, and it's like, you're off to the races, like trying to figure this out from Halloween to that was an intense, not even month, right? That you guys are doing all this. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to put that in perspective because I think, again, another part of your story that's really important is, well, some of it is prolonged, some of it is very fast too. So you've got kind of two dynamics in your story. So I think a lot of different people will relate to your story because, well, you do have the anticipatory grief aspect of it. And, there was this process. It also then, when it turned fast. And that was a difficult part. And so you guys moved him from one care place to the next and he starts chemo, but they found these tumors. So what is the prognosis? What are they saying? Like, what do they think? How long is he going to live? Like, are they throwing this all at you? Kind of walk us through that.
They had not told us any anticipation of how long he had to live. They just wanted to get chemo in him. They wanted to treat him at Sloan Kettering. And that's what they were doing. So he ended up that year in Sloan Kettering in Manhattan for Thanksgiving. And and he was getting chemo. And then he came home the next week, and they had told him, well, you'll come back, we'll do more scans, we'll do more chemo. And then he went back the beginning of December, and they did scans, but then he had another appointment. I remember specifically it was December 8th. I kept texting him all day. I'm like, what's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, I'll talk to you when you get home. And then on my way home, he texts me and he says that I need you, Robert, and mommy and daddy to come over. And I'm like, oh crap. I kind of knew then. And they had told him that day that they couldn't do anything more and that he had 6 to 12 weeks left.
Well,
yeah.
So you and the fam, everybody goes over and he has this conversation with you guys. But I mean, you being the sister and so close and so in touch and like, you just knew. Yeah.
I did, but I wouldn't accept it because I was like, oh, we need to do more. Why aren't they doing this more? Like, they need to take you and they still need to try the chemo. And he kept saying to me, it's not going to do anything. It's too far advanced. I mean, it was stage 4 at that time, but I still to this day, cannot believe how it went from he was okay to stage 4. It's like, what happened in between? Like, where was the in between?
That is the question that I wanted us to touch on too. Like, what did you ever get those answers? Did you ever, because we're going to keep going, of course, but, did you ever get any insight to that? Because it just seems, and also kind of part 2 for this question is, when all of this happened initially in 2019, did they give you guys any indication of what could have caused this?
They weren't sure. The things that came up is he had GERD. With the acid reflux, he also was in the Navy, so he was subjected to whatever he was subjected to because he went to Iraq and all that. I mean, smoking's up there. I mean, he smoked for a good part of his life. So they said that it could be any one of those things, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly which one, obviously.
Which I'm sure is extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
To feel like, okay, yes, I mean, like, we all have vices and things that we do in life, but if like we can't pinpoint something, you're like, oh God, like it's about getting the answers right to the questions that we want. And
right.
We talk about that all the time, right? And
yes.
I think that's a part of this too. And I think it's important to kind of touch on that as well. So kind of walk us through what happens next. Like, he has this conversation with you guys, and what was the plan? What did you guys decide to do? Because I think that's something that happens. Like, families will be like, okay, like whoever's, caring or involved will be like, okay, this is the plan. This is what we're going to do. Like, what was next?
Well, what was next was I found out I was no longer his medical proxy. It was his wife. I mean, of course that was going to happen, but she didn't have any knowledge of any of this stuff. So, and I have extensive background in medical because I was a vet tech and was going to go to vet school. And now I teach a lot of stuff. So I was shocked that he did that. And I'm still confused as to why he did that, knowing that he didn't know any of this stuff. He would call me and he'd like ask all these medical questions. Like, I don't even understand what's happening or what all this means. And I'd explain it to her. And I mean, obviously he did it because she was his wife. So the plan was, she was pretty good when all of this was going down. Like, it wasn't that horrible. She wasn't nasty. She wasn't mean. She did take into account my considerations, and he ended up on palliative care, at home. And he had nurse.
Can you tell people what that is, Samantha? Would you mind?
Palliative care is like the step before hospice. He's not ready to die, or the person's not ready to die, or they're not at that point. So they're just taking care of them like you would be taken care of in the hospital when you're sick. So that's what palliative care is. I do not remember when he got switched over to hospice. I have no idea because it's a blur still.
Did
And I wish I had written things down, but I didn't write them down.
It's so interesting that you just said that, because I just had a conversation with a guest that you'll hear this season. And she was saying one of the best pieces of advice, she's like, I never would have thought this myself. One of the best pieces of advice that I got was a friend was like, start writing everything down right now. Write everything down. So that's my takeaway this season too, I guess, is like, write everything down. So, and me personally, I did write quite a bit down, only because I was forced to do so because of things that were happening. But I think this is great advice because it's applicable to any type of loss that you're going through when you're losing your sibling. Write it down, even if you're like, why am I writing this silly little detail down? Like, I've found his hat in the corner over here, or like just some silly stuff, because it could jog your memory about so many things. So I appreciate you sharing that. That's, I think, important. But okay, and thanks for sharing what that is as well, because for me, I really didn't know what that was. I didn't know what that was until about 2 years ago. And sometimes people will still write it to me and I'll be like, what are you talking about? And then I'm like, oh yeah, positive care. Got it. But I think these are just all the things that if you haven't been through it, you don't know. And that's really what I love bringing to light on this show, is you guys sharing these things and educating other people about it. So he's going through this process, and at what point does he go into the hospital? At what point is, or kind of walk us through that? He's, goes up to hospice. Like you said, you don't have an exact memory. Again, our advice to you guys, write stuff down. It will help.
If you want to remember it, though. That's if you want to remember it.
Yes.
I mean, you may want to later on. Like, I wish I had written it down now, because then I'd be able to remember the sequence of things better. But he never went back into the hospital. Hospice came to the house. And going back, he was not on hospice for long. Like, his wife kind of knew when they needed to come in. And I think he knew and told her, because he obviously was still talking and coherent up until 4 or 5 days before he passed away. And the plan was just, he wanted to die at home. And that was the end of it. I mean, he didn't want to be put in hospital. He didn't want anything else to be done. He was on DNR anyway, because there was nothing they could do to save him because of the extent of the cancer at that point. So that's where we were. And we sat from December 8th-ish until he passed in January 22nd, 2022.
2222. Yeah. It's a really important date for you that I know that just passed. So you're over your 2-year hump, which we're going to talk about that too. That's a big thing to talk about.
It is.
Big thing to talk about. So yes, happy heavenly birthday to Chris. And so tell us a little bit about what happened, because he wasn't on hospice for very long. So we talk about how we get these calls, right? And you've gotten the initial call. You've gotten you've gotten several calls, like, hey, like, he's not doing well again. He's going through this. Chemo is a possibility. This is happening. Hey, guess what, guys? The December 8th call, right? All of this come over, and this is kind of, I'm getting my 12-week, give or take. This is going to be my life. And so there's other calls that happen as well. Kind of walk us through what that was like, because from December 8th to the 22nd of January, I'm sure was extremely difficult as well, because it's just, you're waiting for that call.
Yeah. Well, the waiting for, because the anticipatory grief, like, it's coming, but you don't know when it's coming. I spent a good amount of time there after work, and I feel bad to this day. Like, my life for those however many weeks it was getting home, getting showered, going over to my brother, helping my sister-in-law out with him, and helping take care of him and giving her the break that she needs, because she ended up working from home during that time a lot. And if she went anywhere, she would make sure that I was around to actually go over there. So my weeks were spent being there. And I mean, it felt normal, because Chris and I were still watching movies. He still was playing the video games, and like, my older son was playing the video games with him, and he was getting annoyed at my younger son because he was only like 5 at the time. So he was like not he had no idea what was going on. And he just knew we were over at Chris's house hanging out, whatever, like we usually do. So I don't recall any calls, major calls during that time, which is odd.
Well, you were in a routine, so maybe not, right?
Yeah.
That was what you did. And
Right.
so again, I think a lot of people will connect with this because you do get in that routine. And I've read more books on anticipatory grief and things like that, and just talk to people that have experienced it. So you get in this caretaker routine, and you were a caretaker for him. And so you had a schedule. Like, you got up, you went to work, you showered, you went over there, you took care of your family. Like, I mean, there was a lot of things happening, and you had a lot of responsibility at the same time, which I'm sure that was difficult with your family, right?
Yeah.
Like your husband and your children, I'm sure was really tough.
Yeah. I mean, the only good thing I had is that the boys were 2 years younger. And like my oldest still says to me, I don't remember all that happened. He had just turned 9 right before Chris passed away. And then my little one was only 5. So he really doesn't have much of a memory at all. And I think that's okay, because I'm glad that they don't remember him in that state that he was in. And then when he finally got the hospital bed in the house, and like we were hanging out over there at the hospital bed. But at some point, I remember I was not taking them over there anymore. The calls that I do remember now, I'm like going back, was pretty much every morning I would call my sister-in-law, like, how did the night go? Like, I'm driving to work. Anything new? When's his next appointment with the doctors? So they could check whatever they check in his blood work, and see how far advanced it is. But you're right. It was a routine. Like, we knew it was coming, but secretly hoping that it really wasn't going to come. And all of a sudden he's going to be fine. But in reality, he was not going to be fine. And we would say to him, like, today you look pretty darn good. Like, I think it was just in our minds, like, oh, you're not as yellow today as you were yesterday, and that's what we always would judge his day on, was what color is his skin. So
That's a really interesting point that you bring up too, is that, there's things that you guys were saying, or like even telling yourself a narrative too, like, oh, he looks better today. And I'm curious if, like, reflecting back, you think now, like, he was just having a good day, and that was just me kind of giving myself hope, right? Because that's kind of probably how you got through to the next day and the next day, right?
Yeah, that's imagine. Exactly what, yep. I mean, I don't think it fully hit me that he was going to pass away until the week of him passing away, because that week he started to slip into this weird state and babbling about stuff. And the one thing I remember him saying to my mom was, I got to go home. And I see Grandpa. So like that reality was like, oh my God, he's like in between right now. And he was so uncomfortable. Like, he had spent so much time laying in that bed, but he was so uncomfortable. He kept getting up, sitting back down. And I'd be like, do you need help? Do you want me to take you to the bathroom? Like, all this stuff. And that Wednesday night before he passed, I feel like he said his goodbyes. And it took a full 2 days till he passed. And the last thing he did say to me the night before, he whispered to me, like, that he wanted to die.
Yeah, he was ready.
Yeah, even though, like, in the beginning he was like, why me? Why did I have to do this? I finally got a wife, and I finally have a house, and now I have to leave it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I've heard about. And so I'm really glad that we're like getting into this part in like the week of his passing, because, and I know it's really hard to talk about, and so I appreciate you sharing with all of us about it. But it is something that my mom, it's not really something I've talked about before, but it's something my mom described about when she lost her father back in 2009. And he was older. He lived a very long life, almost 90 years, right?
Yeah.
It's not the same thing at all. But a lot of like hospice nurses and a lot of people talk about this, how like when it starts to get really close, there's almost like this transitional period. So I really love that you're sharing this with us because this is so different than a lot of the other losses that we talk about on the show. So, and I want people to have information and knowledge and connect with your story, which I know they will, and understand that there's other complicated components to this. So it's something I've heard a lot about. I'm actually quite fascinated by it, that during this process, and sometimes people say it lasts for a couple of weeks, but it's usually these hospice nurses, and my mom described it, and there's it's like a 5 to 7 day period, usually somewhere in that, sometimes 2 weeks. Everyone's different. It's like grief.
Right.
We're all different, right? But interesting that you came in and you told like very similar timeline that I've heard from other people. But so he starts to kind of see, and I think this will, regardless of what your spiritual, like what you believe spiritually or religiously, I think this kind of story helps you open up to the reality that there is probably something on the other side.
Even
right?
though I'm
like,
still not okay.
yeah,
There's no way. Like I
yeah,
keep saying that, but
yeah,
when you
yeah.
bring that up and you say that, I'm like, he was seeing our grandfather. And like, I know he was seeing some other people, but I can't remember who exactly, but he specifically said, I see grandpa. And then he was also seeing, that's right, my mom's father, but we didn't know my mom's father because he passed away when my mom was 12 of a heart attack.
So how did you feel about that? You must have been like, whoa, like I can't imagine hearing my brother saying something like that.
Right now, I'm like, whoa, because I didn't think about it then. Like, he saw Grandpa Sam. Like, what? Like, I could see him seeing Grandpa, who had passed away in 2009. But Grandpa Sam, like, we only have pictures of him.
It's crazy.
It is.
It's crazy. But I think it's kind of one of my favorite parts of your story because it's really beautiful. And I think that's, something that we can look at, like they're not alone, right? Like people are waiting for you on the other side, and whatever that means to you or whatever you interpret that is, right? Like if you're super religious and you believe in heaven, or if you're more spiritual and you just think maybe there's possibility, whatever level of the spectrum that you're on, I think this is such a cool part of your story, right? Like in the pain, I like to find these little gifts that we're given. And I think it's good that we're talking about that because
I'm actually happy about it too.
Well, I mean, it's really cool that he saw your grandpa that he knew, but like, what a sign that he's seeing this grandfather that he didn't know.
Right.
Like, that's a huge sign. Like, that would be to me at least. So I really love that. But it's also, I'm sure at the time you were probably more thinking like, oh my God, like, this is it. Like, this is it.
Yeah.
Like, putting myself in your shoes for that, because I don't think, you're also like, you're with your brother and he's actively dying. So you're like, is this real? Like, is he really seeing these people? Is this a real thing? Like, I'm sure that went through your mind too.
Well, I had experienced death of my grandpa that he saw. And I remember him and my dad telling me things about how it was. Well, he was actually in a hospice place, my grandfather. And my dad said that when he was there in the middle of the night, one night, my grandfather woke up, sat straight up, and said, "What are you doing here?" And there was absolutely nobody in the room. And when my brother started seeing things, it brought me back to that kind of stuff. I was like, and that's when I knew, I'm like, it's going to be happening. Like,
yeah.
And I took off the next 2 days because I knew it was coming.
That's important too. Yeah. Like, you knew, you were like, okay, I got to be here. So you were there. So kind of walk us through those kind of last moments. Like, what was that like? I'm sure it was so difficult. And
I felt like he did not want to totally pass away while I was there, because he literally passed away. I left the house at like 11 or 12 o'clock at night. His wife called after 7 a.m. and said that he had finally gone. But the last words still always stick with me, that he wanted to die because he was in that much pain. Like, even though he wasn't showing that, he was always in that much pain. I knew. I felt it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big thing to say, especially to your younger sister, and just be like, I'm ready. Like, I'm ready to go.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
When December 8th, he was not ready to go. Like, the realization to him was like, oh my God, am I really going to die?
Yeah. So when you there's a lot of calls in this anticipatory grief journey. Like now you're getting your call from your sister-in-law and like, so he's passed away. And what happens next for you guys? What did you guys, I mean, you're a tight-knit family. So did you guys kind of band together? I know there have been some highs and lows with your sister-in-law. So what transpired next for you guys?
So she told me she was not going to call my mom because her and my mom were constantly fighting and bickering over stupid things that she caused, not my mom, like her issues or whatever. And maybe that's just how she was dealing with it. I just put it behind me. I don't care anymore. But she had said she was not going to call my mom. Could I call my mom? I said I had to gather myself up, and I called her. And then lo and behold, she had mustered up the strength to call my mom. So after I called my mom, I remember her saying, "Well, what are we going to do?" I'm like, "We go over there. That's what we do." Like, I literally just got dressed, and I remember screaming through the house, like, "I gotta go. Get out of my way. Chris is gone, gone, like, dead." And then I left the house. I met my parents and my younger brother over there, and was only 10 minutes down the street, so it wasn't far. And I remember getting there and just, I actually sat by his bedside. And even though I'm like still in a weird spot spiritually with God and everything, I prayed for him just as I did on the night leading up. I prayed for him. I prayed that his pain was gone and that he didn't have to suffer anymore. And it took a while for the hospice nurse came. I remember that, and she was asking questions, and she pronounced him. And then it took a while for the funeral home to come to pick up his body, but we were there for pretty much all of the morning because they didn't take his body until like 11 or so.
Right.
And my sister-in-law had said, "I don't want anybody in here when they take him." And my mom and I held hands and were like, "We're staying." And we stayed.
Why do you think she didn't want anybody there?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I could not understand her anymore. Like, in that time of Chris passing away, I could not understand like her anger towards my mother, the stupid things she would blame my mother for, and she even locked my mother out of the house from visiting her own son.
Wow.
So I had lost patience with her too, and I didn't care why she didn't want us there, but we stayed. And the funeral home came in, the two guys, they were really nice and caring. And my parents went out before they wheeled him out. My younger brother and I stayed and were behind him the whole time until they put him into the van to take him over to the funeral home. So Robert and I stayed for a little while, and they were really sweet. They let us stay and say our goodbye even more. And then I decided to follow them over to the funeral home, but I had missed them taking him out and which probably is good, because I probably didn't need to see any more of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Being with him through all of this. And yeah, I think again, this is a different aspect of it. And, I think there's a certain time, and I think we all know internally, like, okay, it's, this is the time, this is how I want to remember him or her. And I think with anticipatory grief and dealing with, a loss like cancer, like what you have dealt with Chris, I think, you reach an internal point, and that's only for you to know, like, okay, like I need to get some space from this. And then, I think it's just different. It's also like choosing, do you want to see the body or not? Like different things like that, right? It depends on your loss type.
Yeah.
So do you guys have a funeral for him? What happens next?
There was a lot of fighting about that too, right up until the morning he died, like, because he wanted to be buried. He wanted a specific funeral home. He wanted to be buried in a specific spot, but money was not there because when he left the Navy, I mean, he got honorably discharged, but he told me and my mom, I forgot to check the box for certain things like end of life and burial and all that stuff. So it totally ended up that he had to be cremated, which he did not want.
Mhm.
And he ended up at the military cemetery that's 30 minutes from us. So that was a big, hard blow. But we did have a funeral-like thing because he was already cremated. And at that point, my ex-sister-in-law and I were not talking at all because she was screaming at me on the phone about pictures because I went to the funeral home myself to talk to the funeral director, like, what can I bring in? What am I not allowed to do? And she said, you can bring in whatever you want, but I know his wife is bringing a video thing, pictures.
Yep.
So she said, if you want to make the usual picture things you see at the funeral. So she started fighting with me about that because she wanted to know who I put on the pictures and telling me the funeral is not about me and it's not about my younger brother and it's not about my parents, it's about Chris. But I felt like she was making it more about herself. Like when the funeral happened, she was in the back of the room instead of being up front like the family members usually do, telling her life story. And I'm like, I thought this was about my brother. And it really wasn't that far of a distance because it was a small funeral home. So I could hear some of the stuff. And then some of my friends that were passing through told us, and my mom's friends told us too, like she's back there, like she's in a movie or something. And which I was not surprised because that's how she was.
Mhm. And that's just, there's so many things to unpack with that because, it's interesting because what I found in my own story is that the people who try to control everything the most, that's their way. And I'm not giving her a pass at all. You
Right,
know
right.
what, Samantha? But as you start to move in your grief journey, you start to realize that everyone grieves differently. And
Yeah.
it's probably not the best way to grieve to try to control those types of things or try to bring attention to yourself. But I have a lot of experience with that too. And it's interesting because there's these really trivial and stupid fights that happen that like it's supposed to be about the person. It's supposed to be about each and every person that wants to come and remember them and have their moment to grieve them and whatever capacity that, they can or whatever, fill in the blank. And when those particular people in the grief, and I'm not coming from a place of judgment at all, but I've just noticed this pattern because my mother is definitely the person that did this in my story, my journey. When they make it about themselves, it's because they don't want to grieve. They don't want to grieve. They're not ready. They're not ready to accept it. And so controlling all these really trivial things that like become important because they get exasperated. It's frustrating and it definitely puts a wedge in the relationship, which is what happened in your dynamic for sure.
And the final thing that made me just totally stop talking to her, we had a GoFundMe for Chris when he first got diagnosed, like for traveling expenses and all these extra medical things, And then when we found out that he was not going to make it, I switched it over to funeral expenses. I didn't get that much. I mean, we knew people, but not people with money, and it didn't go all over the world like some of these GoFundMes. There was only $1,700 in it. And I bought 4 urns for my parents and I and me and my younger brother that matched the urn that he was in because we wanted that. I bought flowers and they're darn expensive, like for a funeral. I mean, I bought 2 things of it. I don't know. There was a lot of expenses, like, and then food for the celebration of life. Like I went through that plus some of my own.
Of course you did.
Yeah. And my parents and some other people just randomly just gave us money to help us for the celebration of life, or they cooked something or whatever. But in later in February, I get an email from GoFundMe and it says that we have shut down your account because they're is a report against you that you may have not legally used the money for what it was anticipated for. So I had to provide, it was her. I mean, who else would have done that? I had to provide all the receipts and and paying for the obituary. Like, I paid for that. And that's $100 or whatever it was. And I pretty much used it all. I had receipts for everything, sent it to GoFundMe. And that was when I knew that she was all about money at that point. I did not agree fully to give you that money towards his funeral. Her father actually ended up paying for the funeral cost. I mean, it was cheaper because he was not embalmed and all the other stuff that happened. But she wanted that $1,700 that I used. She told me to buy the 4 urns for herself. She told me to order the flowers. She told me to order more of the cards, the funeral cards, so we had extra in case there were too many people coming for the package that she chose. There may have not been enough funeral cards, et cetera, et cetera. There was so much that went into it. And
there's a whole lot of planning that goes into funeral, celebration of life, all of that. It's a lot. Yeah. And until you go through it, you don't know. And God, I pray you don't have to, but you will at some point in your life be exposed to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a lot. I remember I planned his whole celebration of life, which was separate from hers because we were not talking anymore. And she also refused to give up stuff that he left to us in a will. It was written will. And there's more to it. I could be on here for hours with you, telling you everything that happened, but I know we don't have that time. But I have not spoken to the woman. My husband.
So February was the last time you had communication with her. That was of 2022. Yeah. Wow. And this is the stuff that we talk about too, right? Is that's another part of your story is there's 2 different types of secondary losses, right? Secondary losses can be all the things that you are not going to experience with the loved one that you lost, right? Like all these milestones that he won't get to see with your kiddos and just things like that you go through. But I feel like that's where our spirituality comes in and we have to find what works for us, right? So that we can move with that. But the other type of secondary losses, because it can mean 2 different things, are the people that we lose through this process, right? And she's a secondary loss for you because that was it was contentious. It was a difficult situation. And then now it's another loss because at the end of the day, she was Krista's wife and widow, right? And so that's tough to deal with too. On top of dealing with such a difficult loss, you're dealing with other complicated losses too. And that's really important.
Secondary, sorry.
Okay.
Talking about more secondary loss, I found out that my dad's family did not accept my brother. And I always wondered why my mom was always at odds with my aunt. And the truth came out. And
when did you find this out in your journey?
Not too long after he passed. April, May-ish, because I think that's when I cut off that part of the family. And I decided for my dad's sake, because he was hurt. They didn't even come to the funeral.
Wow, Samantha.
Yeah.
Wow.
Nobody came. And that hurt me. It hurt my mom. And that was when I was they didn't care. Even though they were calling, they were sending stuff. They didn't care. They want my uncle oh, I can't go out because COVID, blah, blah, blah. And we're it's 2022. We're
it's not the same world as 2020 anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're that's the most stupidest thing I've ever heard. So I have not talked to that side of the family, and it'll be 2 years. My younger brother also cut them off because they wouldn't accept my brother, and they didn't accept my mother because of the circumstance. She had another kid already, and my father decided to marry, and you know what? That stuff doesn't even mean anything to me, and I don't know why it means anything to anybody anymore. It's ridiculous.
It's so weird. What is this, 1800?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Weird.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, but some families have weird perspectives on things like that. So again, I appreciate you sharing that because I do think that there's a lot of these family dynamics that people think they're alone in, and we all have dynamics, and then when you go through a loss, it gets magnified.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, you've definitely been through a lot of secondary losses between
Right.
his widow and between, the family, like your extended family. That's a lot. But how do you feel making those choices to put boundaries in place and to say, like, I can't have relationships with you, this person, that person, because it's unhealthy? I know it's hard. How do you feel putting those boundaries in place? Like, obviously it was the right thing to do in your eyes, but kind of share with us what that feels like.
The only one that I regret cutting off was my aunt, who was not my dad's full sister, which is totally bizarre. Like,
Interesting. Yeah.
but the family didn't accept Chris when she was a half sister. Her and I were very, very close. And she even married my husband and I because she was a minister. That's the only one I think of because she was the only one that was ever really involved in my life. Like my uncle, he had money and he would just send these elaborate gifts and stuff. And it was like, why don't you just come see us? Like, come and see my firstborn. Like, he does not need this elaborate gift, whatever it was. I remember like thinking that. I'm like, this is how he buys his love for me. It's buying me gifts. So I'm okay because they never really made an effort anyway.
Yeah.
So
do you see a path where you could have a relationship with your aunt again?
I do, but I know my mom will be upset about it. And I don't want to hurt her in her time. I mean, this is going to go on for her forever.
Yeah.
I mean, my aunt is older. She's like probably getting close to 80 now anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. And that's okay. That's okay to not know. And like, that's a part of a lot of our stories is like, I didn't speak to any of my family for a long time. Right.
Yeah,
and then like, I've decided to incorporate who works for me and not in a like, oh, are you going to do what I say or like what I do? No. Can we coexist in a healthy, and can we accept each other's grief journeys? That's it. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
So no, it's not like a narcissistic thing where it's like, you either subscribe to the way I'm grieving or no, so that's why I'm curious when, people say, well, maybe I'd open the door. So yeah, I think sharing that is important. So Samantha, you're just hitting the end of your cycle. You're going into your third year of grief. So I really want to make sure we touch on this because this is so important in your story. And as you guys know, like I will not have people on the show that are less than 2 years into their journey. And even then, sometimes I'm like, but this is such an important story of anticipatory grief and sharing that this loss is a little, it's elongated, it's a process. And so tell us a little bit. I think, again, this is the biggest question I think I get on TikTok and most places. When do you feel normal again? What's the first year like? What's the second year like? So I'm going to turn it over to you because you just experienced this like very raw, very fresh. So tell us about that. And I feel like this will be so important in this episode.
The first year, I barely remember much of anything happened. And the funny thing is I listened to some other podcast about grief and I've been listening to Anderson Cooper and one of his guests.
Love him. Yeah.
And one of his guests recently, like this month, came on and she was talking about the first year and she had lost her husband suddenly. And she described it more for me than other people. It's like you're a zombie and you're just lurching around trying to find your way and you have no idea what's going on because you're brainless. Like you're just surviving. And that's how I felt the whole first year. And even into past that, I don't think I started to like come to the realization that I am still living until like last summer. And now I more think about a lot of things, like I put things in perspective, like I need to spend more time with my family. I need to make a point to spend time with my mom, a point to spend time with my younger brother, my dad, and make sure I'm here for my kids and my husband. definitely look at the world a different way. Like before this happened, I was always like tunnel vision. Now I actually look at sunrises and sunsets and I'm like, oh, that same sunset happened the day Chris passed away. Like just the weird things like that you don't notice on every day. And you go through your ups and downs. Like I remember constantly sobbing a lot during that first year and staying in bed, and my room was my sanctuary and it was always dark. And now I'm like, I got to get up. I've got to make it work. I've got to do this. Even though I still have days where I'm like, I just don't want to do this, like today. And I know part of it is my grief that I didn't want to go today because I've been battling it and made it through all last week. But it definitely opens your eyes the second year. You realize what you've lost, what you still have, what's ahead, and you want to keep living. Whereas in that first year, you don't know if you really want to. And I hate to say that, but I've heard that from a lot of people. Like they weren't sure if they wanted to stay alive themselves because they had lost their sibling. And it's a hard thing to get through.
Yeah. I've done quite a few episodes on the other side now of this journey of grief. And I've had a few people ask me, but there was one particular no, there's two or three where they asked me, they said, hey, this is a common thing, but after you lose someone, like, this is a hard question. I'm like, just spit it out. I'm an open book. What's the question? They're like, were you ever suicidal or did you ever not want to live? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, just to embody year one. Like that was totally true, and then one particular, I think it was on Susan Casey's episode and maybe one other episode, but they asked me like, did you attempt? And it was the first time I really talked about it. Now I talk about it openly, but yeah, I did. And it was about 2 months after, not even after my brother, probably 2 months, January after. And I just didn't want to. And there were so many reasons why. But, that's something that I really appreciate you being open about because, people are a little, there's a stigma around it. And I don't think there should be. Like, you just lost someone that you really love and they're not here. Why the heck do you want to be here? Like, that's how I felt.
Right.
I didn't want to feel like it's interesting because in the first year, you do feel like a zombie. I think that's a great description too. And but you're also in a lot of pain and you're just like, you almost want to feel something. So it's like, it's very weird. It's a very weird time. And I just think if, you guys can take something away from this episode, which I think you'll take a lot away from this episode, but that's one thing. Just give yourself permission, especially in the first year, to just feel lost because it's normal.
Yeah, it is totally normal. I mean, you're still kind of lost in the second year, but not as bad as that first year. And I just remember like thinking, I could just drive my car down into that ditch right there, like hit the trees and whatever. I'm done. But I got through that somehow, like you did.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, it's interesting that you have like a pretty pivotal moment kind of, or pivotal time where you're like, it was last summer. So you're a little over a year right into it and you're into your second year and you're like, I'm looking at sunsets and I'm looking at sunrises and I'm looking around myself. And like, that was your timeline and everybody has their own timeline. But I do find that in year two, you start to feel again. Like it's like almost a melting of the iceberg right around. And
it
you're
is,
like,
because you do feel it and you're like, what is wrong with me? Like, why do I feel like this all of a sudden? Yesterday I was fine. 2 hours ago I was fine. But I'm like, why do I just feel depressed and down in the dumps? And it's like, how do I dig myself out? But somehow a few days later, you're fine again. And you could be fine for a while. And then all of a sudden it hits you again. Something triggers it. Like last week, I did get triggered by a toy that my brother had gotten my younger son. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to cry about this. So I went in my bedroom and sat and cried about it, and I knew it was coming. So it just happens. You're not going to be able to control any of it.
Right. But it's interesting that you just shared that because you're past the 2-year mark now and you have the tools now. You're like, I feel this. This is a moment for me. I'm going to go to my safe place, which I think that's a really good piece of advice too, Samantha. And I don't know if I've ever really talked about that. I've talked about having like a special place in your house, like to remember them
Right.
and stuff. But I think it's important to have your safe space. Like you're like me, my bed is my safe space.
Yeah.
Like, let me get in my bed with my dogs.
I
That's
need
like
my
my thing.
bed.
Yes. Yeah. But like I'm really proud of you, and I'm proud of you for sharing that too, because like you knew, you were like, I'm going to go feel this. And
Yep.
I think that's what's interesting too, is like when you start to come out of this like zombie-like, fog-like state, you feel so much, and then you start to get the tools like you have. So again, I'm so glad we're talking about this, but you were like, I'm going to feel this, and I'm going to allow myself to feel it. That's
Right.
like when you get to the next, I feel like that's a part of the healing journey, is
Right.
allowing yourself to feel it. Because then when you started to feel, at least for me, it's so overwhelming. You're like, oh God, do I really want to allow myself to feel all this?
Right.
Oh my
I
gosh.
do remember being in that spot too. Yeah. But now I'm like, I'm just going to let it go. Like, if it's in the middle of work, I'm going to just look, it doesn't happen at work. But I mean, whenever it happens, it happens. And I just go with it. And sometimes I've been using my journal on my phone more than writing, because everybody said, oh, journal it. And I'm like, I hate writing everything out with a pen and paper. And finally, I was just like, let me just start recording stuff in my phone. Like, I went from notes, and then Apple came out with the journal recently. So now I've just been journaling it every day that I feel like I need to. And that helps a lot.
Yeah, I love it. Yes, I know. I'm like, yay, the journal. I love it. I think that's so good. And I think it's great because not everybody likes to take pen to paper. I do, just because I was an English major and that was what I did for so long.
Yeah.
But I'm also a talker. So sometimes I want to do like a talk to text type situation, things like that. And thank God for technology. We can do what works for
Right.
us now. And I think that's great advice. What advice would you give? So a couple questions for you before we close out, Samantha, but what advice would you give to somebody going through? I mean, you've given so much knowledge and insight, but what advice would you give to someone who is losing a sibling, like is actively going through a loss right now, whether it is to cancer or some other form of anticipatory grief, right? There's so many illnesses out there, unfortunately. So
Right.
what's some advice that you could give them? Something you wish you would have maybe told yourself? Could go back in time, right?
I know, right? Something I would have told myself was that he really was going to pass away, and I probably could have prepared myself a little more, but I don't know if any preparation is really going to help. Definitely write things down, if you feel like you think you want to remember it. But even if you wrote it down, you don't have to refer back to it. You wrote it down. It's there. At least you were able to feel what you were feeling in anticipatory grief and put it down in pen and paper, or however you want to do it. Like, I wish I had, because right now I wish I could go back and look at the events and look at how I dealt with certain things, because I can't remember. Like, there's two parts of my life, the before Chris passed and the after Chris passed. And if you ask me about any events that happened before Chris passed away, no idea. I can't remember any of it. And I had had to ask, like, my in-laws, like, what did we do that Christmas? Like, where were we? The good thing is my mother-in-law writes things down. So she did write it down. And I'm like, I don't remember any of it. But if you feel you need to remember it, write it all down. Also take your emotions as they come. Like, try not to hold back, because I think it makes it worse. Because I found myself really out of it for days if I held it back and then suddenly just let it go. Find your place. Find your place that you feel comfortable just letting it go, because it definitely will help.
Yeah, I think it's not how I like to meet people, but it's how I meet people, right? Is through loss. And I remember meeting you very early in your grief journey. And I remember you doing that a lot. I remember you holding it in. And it's really beautiful to see where you are now, Samantha, because it's like, and I know like this is a life journey we're all on together,
Yeah.
but it's so interesting, to see where you are now, and the fact that you're like, that's not serving me. Like, that's not going to work for me, is holding it, trying to hold it all together. That's a theme here in this episode too, is control. Cause I think that's what we try to do. And I think we're all guilty of that in grief, but I can see that specifically just in your story, and also being a mom and being a wife and working and and you were a caretaker for Chris, like that's a lot. And so it's quite overwhelming to feel like, oh God, now I've got to go process all of these emotions. Like, no, I got to hold it together. And so, but it's kind of counterintuitive to your point. Like, if the more you hold it in, like, it's not going to serve you and it's not going to work for you. So I think that's a really great piece of advice as well. So again, anticipatory grief is just, it's different. And I think, having documentation, I think that's important too. For me, if I didn't write the stuff down in my own journey, I wouldn't have been able to tell the story. I wouldn't have, because there would have been so many holes, and there still is in my memory. Yeah. It's normal. And let's normalize that, right? Let's normalize the fact that that is the thing. But so the other question I wanted to ask you too is, now coming through, we talked about year one, coming through year two, what are some things that you have your place that you go to, but what are some specific things, coping things, you touched on a little bit, but want to make sure we cover it. What are some specific things that you would kind of give as a gift to people listening to this that are going through anticipatory grief? Like, what are some things that you maybe wish would have done in your coping? Writing down is one thing, having your safe place, but and what are some things that you are doing, right, that you have found that are helpful specifically to your type of loss?
Definitely, I felt like reading the books helps me in the beginning, and listening to your podcast, because it helped me through everything. And I couldn't wait to get in the car and listen to your podcast every week during those seasons. And I could be down in the dumps and listening to other people go through the same thing. Like, find someone or something that you could listen to, or a book you can read. I was not about group. And I know you talk to me about that often. Like, I remember you not wanting to go to group. I went to group once in the September after he passed. And I sat there and cried the whole time. And I'm like, I don't want to sit here and cry this out with these people that I don't even know, which is fine. But now I do groups. Mine haven't started back up yet, but Grief Share is where I found mine. And it doesn't have to be a sibling group. The group that I go to is like everybody. There's people that lost siblings, husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, everything. And it gives you a different perspective on grief. And it's a major learning journey. And you're going to keep learning through it on how to deal with what you're going through the whole time till you die. And that's what I've learned a lot through this.
Yeah. And I think that can sound like Mount Everest to people when they're going through it. It's like, what? I'm going to be doing this? Yeah, at the beginning. But then I think it's actually, it kind of turns into a nice thing, because it turns into like, okay, like, it's not so scary anymore. It's already happened. I'm not going to feel like this every day, every minute. Right. And I remember meeting you and you were like, I'm going to feel like this forever. I remember you saying stuff like, you're like, and I'm like, yes, girl, that is how it feels. Like, you are in this horrible club with us, but you're not. And so it's just really awesome to, be here 2 years later with you and hear all these tools. And like, I love it because, that you're going to, Grief Share group, you go to our group, like this, you were the girl that did not want to do group.
Right.
That is so true.
Right.
And now you're so open in our group and other groups, like, you're amazing. And like, but I think it's all, this whole phrase of time heals all wounds, that's so false. And a lot of people rephrase it, but time allows you to grow with your grief.
Right.
And that's really what I think has happened with you, for sure.
It's never healed. There's always going to be that scab there, basically. So that's what I related to. It does get better. And I know people, because I hated people saying that to me in the beginning too. I'm like, no, it's not going to get better. There's no way this is going to get better. Like, my whole heart was ripped out of my chest when my brother passed away. But you learn to get through it. You learn what works for you. you learn to smell the flowers again. You really do. And you have those happy days. And then those happy days, you get more of those happy days. And then you'll slip into that grief again for a little bit. Normal.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Samantha, is there anything else that you want to share with us, or anything that I missed in your story that you want to touch on today?
There probably is more, but we'll do it another time.
Part two.
Yeah, I can,
Two
it's
more
just
year
so
check-in.
much. Yeah, it's just
Tell
so
us,
much.
it is a lot. It is a lot, but I think this is really great and helpful for anybody who's wanting to understand what the first year is like, what the second year is like, and what that changes. And of course, if you're going through an anticipatory grief situation. And so thanks for sharing all of that with us. Where are you comfortable? I know you're very active in our group, but where can people reach out to you if they're dealing with anticipatory grief or connect with your story?
I am mostly on Facebook, but I'm kind of hidden because I'm a teacher. I do have Instagram and I do have TikTok. I mean, people can find me. My whole name's on Instagram and TikTok, but not on Facebook. So it's
Okay,
easier to find me through Insta and TikTok.
perfect. So we'll put the links in the show notes if you guys want to connect with Samantha. And then, of course, you're very active in our Facebook group. So that's
Right.
always in the show notes too. So you could always find her there and supporting our group. And again, I'm just so grateful that you wanted to come and share your story. And this is an early loss story, in the spectrum of what we talk about on this show. But I think it was really needed. So thanks for sharing you, and thanks for sharing Chris. And thank you for Chris for serving as well, and for serving the country. That's huge.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Samantha.